about what's going on in the 2020 section assembly, what we should be preparing for, what are the hot issues, to really prepare us to make some difference in 2020 in Georgia. A couple of housekeeping things. The bathroom is over here. It is unisex. There is one bathroom. So I'll have to pull it. It's necessary. Before I start, I want to give a shout out to the coalition members that helped to plan this event. We have Becky Butler and Molly Perry. Adam Watkins from First Tuesdays, way in the back. Martha Shockey from Indivisible. Kat Bird from Fair District. And Gail Cowie, who is both from Indivisible Georgia District 10 and heads up the Georgia Indivisible. So the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to learn about the inner workings of the Georgia legislature, including the horse trading that goes on in terms of getting a bill from being a bill to being a law. And that's quite complicated and interesting, so Sally is going to talk with us about that. Sally was elected to the Georgia Senate as part of the Blue Wave. She defeated a 20-year, very entrenched Republican opponent. I just think she exemplifies the Blue Wave. Because she's a champion of progressive causes, from gun control to public education, from reproductive freedom and health care, reapportioning and redistricting, blood contamination in drinking water, and protecting our environment. All of those causes that we hold dear, and Sally has our backs. And we know sometimes it's an uphill battle in this state, but I feel so very fortunate to have Sally representing me. And so, please welcome Senator Sally.
Good afternoon on this warm, muggy day. So we are now 10 days into January, 10 days into 2020. It's a big year, right? 10 days, it's been a bit bumpy so far, huh? I got a Christmas present this year. I have a 20-year-old son, and he brought a Christmas present home for me from his girlfriend's mother. It was a box of tea, and it said it was organically infused with sleep aids. So I said to my son, "Oh, does your girlfriend's mother know I'm having trouble sleeping?" And he said, "Well, yeah." I'm like, "Okay, well, how does she know I'm having trouble sleeping?" To which he replied, "Well, you're in politics, aren't you?" So there you go. I got about 4 hours sleep last night. I've been asked to speak on how a bill becomes a law. But I also went to the lunch that happened before this, and so I want to talk about that for a minute before I get started, because going to the lunch, how many of you were there? Okay, probably like 2/3 of you or so. Okay, so going to that lunch brought back memories to me, because I saw two people that I met like three years ago, was that long? At a protest outside Senator Isaksen's office. This was right after Trump got elected, and I had put myself out to be a candidate for Congress for the 6th District. Because at that point, we had had a Democrat on the ballot before, but it was some dude named Rodney Stooksbury. Nobody knew who he was, but he was the Democrat on the ballot. And right after Trump got elected, knows who he is, I could at least get up a webpage. So I put my name out there and got up a webpage and started going to all these events, and that's where I met these two people, Hope and James. And and so I got to see them again at the lunch, and it brought all these memories back, and how far we've come since then. And shortly after, about that time, we all started seeing a document that was being passed around. It was called the Indivisible Guide. And we all read it and was like, wow, this is really awesome stuff, because it was written by some staffers, some DC staffers who had worked in offices in Washington, D.C. during the rise of the Tea Party. And they watched how the members, or the members of the Tea Party, the grassroots initiative of the Tea Party, they watched how they worked and how they generated phone calls to congressional offices and how they got their attention and things like that. And they could see that it works pretty well for the Tea Party, so they wrote a guide on how we can do that from our perspective. And thus was born the Indivisible movement. And so here we are. And we can do this kind of thing in the state of Georgia too. I think one of the things we've learned over the last 3 years is that it's not all about Washington. In fact, as Washington gets more and more dysfunctional, can everybody hear me, by the way? It's a very reverberant room.
We have a microphone if you'd like it.
Pardon me?
We do have a
Well,
microphone.
in the back. Do I need a mic?
No.
Okay. Well, mics might cause too much reverberation too in this room. So if at any point you can't hear me, please raise your hand and tell me. I do tend to have a loud voice. So. As Washington gets more and more dysfunctional, what happens at the state level becomes more and more important. Because we could deal with health care at a congressional level, but we have to deal with it at a state level. We could deal with gun reform in Washington, but it's not working, so we have to do it here. So we are challenged in the state to keep up with all this work with the little citizen legislature that we have. I mean, we have 40 days. You know, it's stretched out a little bit. We're paid a part-time salary because we're expected that we're not in session. We're supposed to go back home and make a living a different way. So we're not paid enough to actually live on, but yet the work is becoming more and more full-time. In fact, this is a different topic, but I would advocate now that we need a full-time professional legislature in Georgia just to handle the issues in a professional and research-based way. In fact, and we'll talk about this in terms of how bill becomes a law, but the very, very short structure is allowing the leadership to be less transparent and push things through without the input of our people and our democracy. So it's actually backfiring on us at this point. So, okay. I want to get to know my audience. So let me ask, I asked how many people were there at lunchtime. So you heard this wonderful presentation on the budget. It was really, really good. How many people live in the Atlanta area? Okay, who doesn't? Who doesn't? And how far did you come? Okay, Athens. Okay. Athens. Dahlonega. Noonan. Coweta. Okay. All right. Thanks. And how many of you are indivisible groups? How many aren't? Okay. Give me a smattering of what group you are.
Fair Districts, Georgia.
Okay.
Fair Districts.
Okay.
Painted blue.
Paper blue. Okay. Anything else? Okay, very good. How many of you feel like you know just about everything there is about how bill becomes a law? Is that because they're teaching civics in school or because your mom's taught you? Both. Okay. You got it covered. How many of you feel like as they taught you in Schoolhouse Rocks on how, Okay, so this is what I'm gonna do. You should have a handout. Does everybody have the handout that looks like this? Okay, got your handout? I just want to spend no more than 5 to 10 minutes just doing the Schoolhouse Rock version of this chart. Just going through each step in a very technical way, so we can get each of those steps back in our heads. What I have learned about how a bill becomes a law is it's not so much what's inside the box that matters, but what happens outside the box that matters. So I want to spend no more than 5 or 10 minutes just going through the inside the box stuff in a very technical, kind of boring way, and then we're going to go back and talk about what each of those steps means and what happens outside the box, and what we can do as advocacy groups and indivisible groups to impact how those issues go through the process. Okay, so let's do the little technical thing, just to get it back into our heads. You got to have an idea for a bill, right? Okay. The legislator, a representative or a senator, takes the idea and goes to this little office that's inside the Capitol on the 3rd floor called the Legislative Council. That's a group of, I think, a little bit more than a dozen lawyers who work for the legislature, and each is hired because they have an expertise in one particular part of the code, of the Georgia Code, and they know, they're familiar and knowledgeable about the Georgia Constitution, okay? So the legislator goes into the Office of Legislative Counsel, says to the receptionist what his or her idea is. The receptionist figures out what part of the code section it should be in, and therefore which attorney they should talk to, and you go to the office of one of the attorneys. Remember that this room in the Capitol would have been part of the old Capitol and not closed offices, so they have teeny tiny little stairs and hallways you have to walk through. Probably the fire people probably wouldn't be very happy with it. But you have a confidential conversation with an attorney. You share the ideas. The attorney helps you think through some questions, and then the attorney says, okay, I will draft that into a bill. Give me a few days and I'll put it in your folder when I'm done. And you wait a few days or sometimes a few weeks, and then you go pick up the bill and you drop the bill is how they talk about it, or you put it in the hover. What that means is you give it to the clerk's office or the secretary of the Senate's office, and they officially file it and give it a bill number. Yes?
What if you don't like how it's worded, or it doesn't quite get the essence?
Now you're getting outside the box, and let's go back to that after we get through all the technical process. But that's a good question, we'll get to that. Okay? All right, so the bill then has a number, and then there's slight differences between how the House does it and how the Senate does it, and I don't want to get into that because it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is, within a day or two, it comes up, and the Speaker of the House or the Lieutenant Governor of the Senate assigns the bill to a committee. And there's these things called readings, first and second readings. They occur different times in the House and the Senate. And the reason we have these readings is not because it's important. It's not really something you have to know. But there was a day when you didn't print everything out. You couldn't print it out and be able to look at it. So it's kind of like my mom had 4 girls, okay? So she couldn't keep track of who she told something and who she didn't. So we were always getting mad at her. It's like, we're doing dinner tonight? You didn't tell me that. She goes, I thought I told you that. So that happened in the legislature too. So they developed a process so that all the bills are read and all the kids are told. And nobody could say they didn't know. oh, it's been read once, oh, it's been read twice. You don't need to worry about that. So you have your first and second reading. It's assigned to the committee, and then if the committee chairman or chairwoman is willing to cooperate, then you will discuss the bill in committee. You might have a public hearing, or where no action is taken on the bill, or you might have some discussion about the bill with the committee, and then they might vote on the bill. This is where the real work of improving a bill or not improving it happens. This is where you get into the nitty gritty, and the people who are on that committee really take a deep dive, hopefully, into the content of the bill and make changes, amend it. This is where the public gets involved, might come speak about the bill if it's something you're interested in. It's where the lobbyists have input into the bills. And sometimes they're industry focused, so they bring that expertise. It's not always a bad thing. But the bill probably is going to get changed in the committee. And
What number are you on right now?
oh, well, I've got this, so I don't know. 6? 6, 5, 6? Okay. I've got like a different little cheat sheet. So at the end of the committee hearing or committee meeting, then the bill is either going to pass or not pass. Or they might just choose to not take action, and it might just sit there in the committee. Then you might have another reading, which doesn't matter. And if the bill does pass, then it's placed on the calendar. And then you have this other committee come in that's called the Rules Committee. And this is a step in the process that's really, really important, and a lot of people don't know about it. The Rules Committee is like a big strainer. It's where all the bills who get to committee, through committee go, but most of them don't get out. Okay? The Rules Committee is a committee made up of members of the legislature, House and Senate, separate though, who usually have more seniority and more power. And basically, they get to decide if the bill is going to come to the floor for a vote. This is a really important part of the process because we have certain leaders who kind of take it upon themselves to make sure certain bills don't get to the floor, and that can be a good thing. So, or that can be a bad thing, either way. But it's where the people with a lot of seniority have a lot of input. So a lot of bills die there. It's said that the Rules Committee chairman, usually men, I've never known a woman to be chair of rules, that's one of the most powerful positions in the legislature.
So, like,
Yes.
are those committees comprised of Democrats and Republicans, or how is that determined?
Well, it's determined like all other committees. The powers that be, the speaker, the lieutenant governor, they choose who's on what committee, and they choose that at the beginning, at the first session of a term, and they stack it so that they have control over it.
So
they're
there's
gonna-
no limits on it, has to be this many Republicans or this many Democrats?
No. In the House, the size of the committees can even fluctuate from year to year. In the Senate, they stipulate the rules, how many people are on each committee, but the Republican-Democrat balance is not stipulated. That's up to the leadership to determine. Okay, so say a bill does get through the Rules Committee and goes to the floor for a vote, then you have a certain amount of debate on the bill on the floor, and a vote is taken and it passes or it doesn't pass. One place where people start getting really confused is that you work really hard to get a bill through to a floor vote, and you think you're done, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's only one chamber. We've got to go through this whole process again, unless you're Nebraska. Nebraska is the only state that has a unicameral legislature. otherwise it's two chambers. And sometimes we do forget. And I know when I was in the House, it was so much work to get stuff through the House, then it was like, oh man, I don't know any of the senators. And you go over there and you feel really lost. Or the senators get really lost when they go to the House because there's 180 of them. So you have to do that process that I described completely over again in the other chamber. And then if there are changes made in the other chamber, then it has to go back to the original chamber for what we call agrees or disagrees, because it can't pass both chambers if one chamber said they want the bill to look this way and another chamber says they want it to look this way, then they have to work it out. And oftentimes what they do, if they are not in agreement, is they appoint a, conference committee, 3 senators, 3 reps, and they go someplace in the Capitol and they have it out with each other and they come out with a compromise piece of legislation that then becomes the bill that passes. And then it goes, if both chambers are in agreement on the bill, then it goes on to the governor, who can then sign it or veto it or not sign it and have it automatically go into law within a certain amount of time. Most bills, most laws, unless they're stipulated differently, go into effect July 1st of the next year, unless it's stipulated differently. Okay, so that's the nuts and bolts. How'd I do?
Very good.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm not asking because I don't know, but just for the people in the room, can you explain how conference committee, sometimes that is happening literally on signing day, and so sometimes legislators are not seeing that bill that came out of the conference committee until that day, and there's a rule that says it has to be on the desk
Printed and on your desk.
for an hour. But if you know, if anyone has been at the Capitol signing that, there's also like a whole bunch of other bills. And so you put it on your desk, but at the same time, you're going through so many other bills. It's really hard to actually know what changed.
Right.
And so that's always a little, something I learned from my position.
That's right, that's right. So yeah, these conference committees are happening, and you don't really even know they're happening, and you don't know where they're happening, so it's really hard for people to track the discussion of what's going on. And we're still in the chamber voting on other things while these changes are being made, and sometimes they can be massive changes. And then it's put on our desk and we're expected to be experts on it and vote. And so this is an example of how the old-fashioned 40-day citizen legislature is really not working well for us as we grapple with more and more serious, difficult policy issues that don't get the scrutiny that they need. And it bugs people like Jasmine, like Representative Clark. It really, I mean, she likes to do her studying, and it's hard for us. So, yeah. Okay, yes.
And how are your constituents supposed to weigh in on those as well?
Right. So again, how the process is not really working well for democracy. I find that to really track a bill and know what's going on with it, it's like you have to hire somebody to be down there to watch it every single day. Certain things have improved the transparency, like streaming and things like that, but it's not a process that people, the general population, has enough time to keep up with. And not everything is streamed either. So big businesses who have interest in what happens at the state capitol, they put a lot of money into hiring lobbyists who walk the hallways the entire session, and they know what's going on, and then they tell, their businesses, and that works really well, but that takes money. I know a handful of nonprofit organizations that try to raise enough money to do the same. I used to work for one, and that can work well, but it is not a process that is set up well for involvement with the public.
With the last hour changes, you don't have insight into those last hour changes, and you don't have time for your constituents to weigh in the last hour.
That's right. That's right.
And-
That's why I would advocate for a full-time professional legislature.
And can I add to that, online, and the closer you get to the end of session, what's online is not what we're voting on. Like, it's just, the bill online is not being updated.
Talk louder, Jess.
Sorry, the
You can
bill.
stand up and talk with me if you want. No, please. And Representative Quinn just walked in too, so.
Yay! I'm just saying that the bill that's online is not always the text that we're voting on right then. They'll eventually update it, but as we get close to the end of session, things are happening so fast and they're changing so fast, and electronically, I can't even look it up electronically and have confidence that what I'm looking at electronically is what I'm voting on. I have to get the physical sheet of paper in my hand. So that's just something for you all to know, so you can understand why maybe sometimes we don't even know what changed, unless someone is sitting in a room that's able to tell us, oh, in rules, they added this, or in rules, they took it out, or something happened. That's how so the closer you get to the end of session, the more things are done by word of mouth and less by being able to track it electronically. So being there actually is probably the easiest way to know what's going on.
Rich?
In a year with a very dubious budget cut forthcoming, alongside a ill-advised tax cut, what is the appetite from the majority party for going from a 40-day to a year-round legislature?
I have
Such that-
not even heard that discussed.
I would imagine.
I don't think it's even out there.
I would
It's
imagine
not.
within the halls, if you talk to literally anybody who's paid $17,000 a session or whatever you guys are paid in that range, Republican or Democrat, they would probably say, yeah, this is a year-round job and we should be compensated for it, but I don't know that there's true appetite. I'm asking you, is there appetite?
No.
No.
No, and it would be a difficult, I'm not saying we shouldn't make the case, I'm standing up here saying it, and there's a camera going on, so, but mostly you hear jokes about, oh goodness, the legislature's in session, expect crazy stuff to happen, crazy stuff always comes out of the legislature, let's get them in and out of there as fast as we can before bad things happen. So that's really how people think. So if I stood up and said, I think we need to meet year-round, I'd be laughed at. Now, there are a dozen states that do operate that way, but in Georgia, we're a long way away from that. I'm not saying we shouldn't. There are very good reasons to do that, but we're not there
It's
yet.
more of a long-term goal.
It's a long-term goal, yes.
When you talk about funding, this morning, she talked about a new law that was passed, and there's no funding for it. So is funding not included in the passage of a law?
Right, okay, so yeah, there's bills, and then there's the budget, and the budget is a bill. And the budget bill also always has to originate in the House, just a little tidbit there. But those go through separate paths. So, like, I'll give you an example. My first bill that I passed was to require universal screening of newborn babies for hearing, okay? The bill actually set the standards and created an advisory committee within the Division of Public Health. And that was the bill, but at the same time, I was advocating for money to be put in the budget under the Division of Public Health to fund that committee, but those were two separate things that had to be worked on through two separate bills. So the what was brought up about the needs-based scholarship, there was the bill that created the program for the needs-based scholarship, but no money was put in the budget for it. So it's just kind of enacting legislation, and it's kind of not, it's not active until there's money behind it. Separate processes.
Where are, you alluded to the rules committee and, the sort of pinch points where bills that are kind of make or break for bills. Can you give us a sense of where are the pinch points? Where, if we want to promote legislation that has been dropped, where do we need to oops things along?
Okay. That's, I'm gonna get to your question, but I'm gonna spend some time with this one. So if I forget, remind me, okay? I'm gonna try to remember that you've had your hand up. Okay, so how do you help that along the process within your networks of people? Okay, so what I've been saying along my whole campaign, my motto when I talk to advocates is be loud. Okay, so that's my first piece of advice to you, is be loud no matter where you are. If you're in the reddest district and you think, why should I speak up? It won't make a difference. Stop that way of thinking. You are a person with progressive values that lives in a red district. They need to hear from you. Okay, that's the whole indivisible thing, right? By be loud, I mean speak up, call your legislator, email your legislator, come to the Capitol, visit. Let these people know, even if they're Republicans, let them know that who you are, what you stand for, what you believe in, which bills you want to see passed, even if you live in a red district. It is very, very, very important that when you advocate for a particular bill or issue, that you are a constituent. Okay? It's very ineffective to try to call a legislator if you're not in their district, unless you're like some sort of leader with knowledge of the expertise, like you work for, I don't know, you're a professor at Emory or something like that, and you're the nationwide expert on the subject, and you might be able to get an ear, but if you're not a constituent, you don't have the power that you do if you are a constituent. And that's why it's important to build our networks. Because if I happen to know that Senator Kay Kirkpatrick is kind of waffling on an issue and she could go one way or the other, I need people who are in her district to call her to say, it's okay, we have your back. If you're gonna stick your neck out on this issue for us, we have your back and we appreciate it. But that message best comes from a constituent. So you have to, as leaders of individual groups, you kind of have to really do a lot of analysis in terms of, who is the author of the bill? What committee is the bill going to? And who sits on those committees? And where do they live? And who do I know who lives in those places whom I can get a message to say, contact this person? So that really requires us to strategically build our networks across the state, which I know Fair Districts is doing a really good job of. You're really doing a good job of getting out into the rest of the state. You are. That's the model to follow. Also, when you communicate with these legislators and you know that you're actually a constituent, make sure they know by putting your address on it. I'll open things and I'll look and it's like no address, it's not a name I recognize, I don't pay much attention to it. But if there's an address on it and I know that it's in my district, I pay a lot of attention to it. So that's important.
But Sally, if we're writing a committee, my understanding was that was very important because the committee is addressing something
It's true, but, and it doesn't hurt to reach out to committee members who aren't your district, but what I want you to understand is that your message isn't as strong. You got like 1/10 of the power. If you're a constituent, you got lots and lots of power. If you're not a constituent, you got about this much. That's the reality. Okay, we can touch on that more as we go along. Back here.
I just want to really clarify, because we're going to be sending out a lot of calls to action during the
Yes.
session.
Yes.
And so what I'm hearing is that it sounds like number one best possibility is to find people who are in the district of those legislators.
Yes.
But absent that, or in addition to that, it still is worth it to write and call. When
Yes.
it's, okay, great, thank
Yes.
you. I just want to make that
Yes.
really clear.
And also, when you refer to a certain bill number, it's very, very helpful to not just say House Bill 272, but put a little tagline on that says what it is. Because there's a few thousand bills, and they change every 2 years. So, we don't memorize all the numbers. Your question back here, remember? I said I was gonna.
So this goes back to a process question, and I want to understand kind of this process. So the fact that we have no electronic copy of a current bill, but you get a paper copy, which clearly was in this day and age created on electronic media, is that a rule?
You can find electronic copies of the bills.
No, but I just heard it in terms of being on the floor to be able to see what's
She
going
was
on.
saying that in the final hour, last day of the legislature, when things are moving so quickly, that changes are made and the system isn't updated fast enough. That's like on the last few days.
The website isn't updated.
But again, it's click. I mean, I do that kind of stuff. It's click and it's updated. That's the part that I'm like, there's something that just doesn't smell right on that to me.
There were some bills
Right.
last time out, and they actually had screenshots of the handwritten notes on them as they were going through. So it's not always electronically updated, especially when they're going that fast.
Okay, that's,
So it
what-
takes
that's
time for
different.
attention.
That's
I
true.
mean,
We do
I-
get copies of bills that have handwriting on them
Okay.
in the last few days. But do you all know about the Georgia General Assembly website? Okay, it's very, very useful. Very useful. You can find pictures of all the representatives. You can find what committees they're on. You can look up the bills. It's a very useful site. So everybody knows about that, it sounds like. Okay. Yes.
In the very beginning, it says that the legislator has an idea.
Yeah.
But I've read a lot about ALEC and other groups that
Yeah.
write the bills.
Yeah. This is the idea. So the idea for a bill is something I want to talk about a little bit. So yeah, I kind of wanted to go back through the process so we can kind of start at the beginning of the process again. Legislator has an idea. What does that mean? Where does the idea come from? It comes from a lot of different places. Ideally, it comes from a legislator like me going out in my community and listening and hearing and thinking about how you can come up with legislative solutions. An example is this fall, people in DeKalb County, particularly where I represent, got really, really, really upset about school trailers because there were so many and they were moldy. And they were sitting on concrete blocks near busy streets that there could have been an accident, and those concrete blocks weren't secure, and it was just a disaster waiting to happen. So I met with them several times, and I'm now drafting a piece of legislation that's called the Permanent Classroom Act that regulates set standards for school trailers. Things like they can't be used past their useful life. They have to have a plan for replacing them. They have to be accessible to fire lanes, et cetera, et cetera. So ideally, that's how it works. But we all know it doesn't always work that way. Ideas come from lobbyists, and that's not a bad thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because the state regulates businesses a lot. And people in certain businesses know their business and they know what they need, and they are experts, and we legislators do rely on them to educate us about issues we don't know anything about. So a lot of times bills come from lobbyists. The hearing screening bill that I told you about came from the Georgia Academy of Pediatrics, actually the American Academy of Pediatrics, because it was a national movement. So that was a lobbyist-driven bill. It was a good one. But there also are these think tanks that come up with state legislation and then start pushing it out to all the states, and they actually give the legislators, instead of the legislator going to legislative council, initially, from these national organizations, they get already drafted bills. They do still have to go to legislative council and get it redrafted so it's in our system, but then you start seeing bills that look the same from state to state. That's when you get suspicious that something like that is going on. Ideas, okay, so ideas. Ideas for bills is an area where we can do a lot of advocacy, because we can play defense, or we can play offense and define who we are by the bills that we draft and file, okay? Even if we can't get them moved, it's still worth the effort to get ideas down on paper and get them filed and to write press releases and have hearings and get our ideas out there and form a narrative of who we are and what our values are. So we did a really good job of this in the House and the Senate this year, with, like, the House even kind of divided their caucus into groups, right? Subject groups, and legislation was written in each of those subject areas. It was very organized. And the Senate did a similar version of that. I have, like, a bill, as an example, that I'm getting ready to file that's an alternative Medicaid bill. In order to, and its purpose is not to get it passed, but it's to change the Medicaid narrative. Because I heard over and over again, as we were discussing Medicaid expansion, that Medicaid is a broken system. And what I was reading, that people who have Medicaid consistently have very high satisfaction scores. They like it, they want it, they appreciate it. And so customer satisfaction is actually pretty high. If Medicaid is broken in Georgia, it's because the legislature broke it by not increasing reimbursement rates for 20 years. So we have the power to fix it. So I have drafted a Medicaid public option bill that allows people, no matter what their income level is, to choose to buy into the Medicaid system at cost. Okay, so if you don't like your private policy, then you can choose to be on Medicaid. And part of the purpose of that is to encourage people who don't like their private plan because they have to pay so much every month for premiums that they can't afford to access the care, and there's a $10,000 deductible anyway. If you're not happy with that, then you can choose to buy a fairly low-cost public option. But if it's not there yet, if the bill's not passed, you're going to pick up the phone and you're going to call a legislator and you're going to say, please support this bill, Medicaid public option, I want Medicaid. Well, that's going to get the legislator's attention because they've never gotten a call from somebody before saying, I want Medicaid. So what does that begin to do to the narrative? Okay, so we have a tremendous opportunity to come up with ideas. Go to your legislator. If you've got an idea like that, go to your legislator and ask them to draft it. Then the legislator, or you, or people in the community, can get the bill filed, and then you put some effort into communication. You write press releases, and you get some attention out of the media. Ask your legislator, if the legislator can't get a hearing for a bill, which we kind of have some problems with getting hearings. I was at a breakfast with Stacey Abrams the other day, and she said, you can't get a hearing from your bill? Have a fake one. Reserve a room at the Capitol, send out a press release, have people come, and have your own hearing.
So are you talking, this is before it goes to the legislative council, or after?
Well, this is before and after. The idea is before.
So but don't they reject bills sometimes? Or they write it in such a way that it's useless?
No, well, okay, let's talk about the second step, legislative council, okay? You do have to keep an eye on legislative council, okay? You can go in there with an idea, and they will hand you the bill, and if you're not astute and read the bill, you might find, you should be astute and read the bill, because you might find they didn't quite write it the way you wanted them to. And they're maybe trying to play a little trick on you and see if you're reading it. And so you do have to watch what they write very carefully. I go back and forth. It sometimes takes a long time to get a bill drafted because I'm going back and forth with legislative counsel. You know, you can't, I want an education bill. You can't do that because it's unconstitutional, because of the way the Georgia Constitution is written and gives power to local boards. And I don't care if the bill's not constitutional, I want it drafted. You know, House Bill 481 wasn't constitutional, right? Let somebody challenge it. I can think that way too. So you do have to watch legislative counsel.
But they can't reject an idea.
Oh, no. And everything you discuss with them is confidential.
Are they nonpartisan? Or are they supposedly nonpartisan?
They know who they're working for. Okay? Now, do they treat us different on purpose? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, the thing is, when things start going fast during the legislative council, or during the legislative session, and the leadership needs amendments right now, they're gonna write the leadership's amendments first, before they get to my bill that they know is not gonna get any attention anyway. So, yeah, they give a little more attention to the party that's in majority. Is that wrong? Is that on purpose? Is that biased? It might slow down getting my bill drafted.
Is there any benefit to filing bills that are really pie in the sky in Georgia? Like,
Yes.
like really good gun control laws,
Yes.
marijuana legalization? Does
Yes.
that make any sense?
Yes. Yes, we need to file them, because we need to talk about them. And we need to do those press releases.
Call the messaging bills like the invisible cell.
Yes.
Folks, if we could hold our questions for a little bit, because we're about to run out of time.
Yeah, I've got 15 more minutes. Max, right? Let's see. So idea, drafting, getting a bill assigned to a certain committee, we have no say in that. The speaker and the lieutenant governor, they decide that completely on their own. Nobody has any sway over that. Getting it heard in committee. Okay, here's one of the things that happens outside the box. It doesn't happen automatically that your bill gets assigned to a committee and then it comes up for a vote or hearing. The legislator actually has to go and beg the committee chairman for that to happen. There's a lot of personal begging on our part, right? Each step of the way, we have to go personally beg whoever's in charge of that step to take movement on the bill. So, like for instance, I had my repeal of campus carry. I knew that wasn't gonna pass. My only hope was that we could have a public hearing on it and generate some attention. And so we have not only, for every bill we file, we have a communication plan and an advocacy plan, okay? So our advocacy plan included, that bill got assigned to the Public Safety Committee, which was Senator John Albers, who happens to live north of my district and is the #1 pickup seat for the state Senate. It's the next most flippable district. And that bill got assigned to his committee. I was so happy when the lieutenant governor assigned it to that committee, because I knew I had lots of advocates up there. And this is a good case example, I could get the word out to Senate District 56, the North Fulton Democrats, Indivisible 6, all those groups up there, you too, and they could start spreading the word and just hound Senator Albers to have a public hearing. Because it was gonna make him look bad if he had a public hearing or didn't have a public hearing. So this was just a grand opportunity. And we did that. Leading up to the Moms Demand Action Day, we flooded this man's email, social media, telephone. We did exactly what Indivisible is supposed to be doing, okay? So that when Moms Demand Action Day came along, he literally said to one of the Moms Demand Action people, next time, could you just ask me for a public hearing instead of taking over my social media? I mean, this is what we need to do. This is being loud. This is being loud. Unfortunately, it still didn't work. Okay, we still didn't get a public hearing. It wasn't until the last day of the session that I was still begging him for a public hearing, and he finally just looked at me and he said, "Sally, I can't." I'm like, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because the governor said so."
Wow.
So you guys, that's the power of the governor's office, okay? So I took one more step, and that same day, Senator Albers came to me and said, "I need your signature on a City of Roswell hotel tax bill." I'm like, first of all, I was like, I don't have the City of Roswell in my district. He goes, "Yeah, you do." I'm like, "No, I don't. Look at my map. It's the Chattahoochee River is the border. And Roswell is all north of that." He said, "Yeah, but there's a section of the river." I'm like, "Yeah, right. Prove it to me." So we got GIS software out. And we zoomed in on the Chattahoochee River, and sure enough, Senate District 40 went past the line and into the city of Roswell, but only in the river. So I represent Roswellian fish. They are native born. But so when I did find out he really did need my signature, I said, "Well, I'm not going to sign it. That's a tax increase. If I sign a bill that's a tax increase, you're going to use that against me during my next campaign, so I'm not signing it until you give me a hearing." I felt so smart. But it backfired on me, because then I was told that they could go around me by having a committee hearing on that local legislation. So I said, "Have a committee hearing, that's fine." But then the guy who was the chair of that committee came to me and said, "Well, I don't like that you're having to make me have a committee meeting, Sally. So I'm going to hold up your Brookhaven bills if you don't sign the Roswell bill." So Rich signed the Brookhaven bills. I mean, I signed the Roswell bill so that Brookhaven could have their stuff. So I lost any power that I had. But it was fun. And that is how indivisible needs to work. So we as legislators will try to get the word out to you when we have opportunities like that. We'll try to match the advocacy work with the right people, so your actually constituents, as best we can, so that we can affect change in committees and to get more public hearings. But if that doesn't work, next time we're having our own hearings, okay? Yes, 5 minutes, okay. Really, I mean, I can't think of anything else, that happens outside the box. I think I've kind of hit it, so if we want to take a couple more questions, that's fine. Yes?
We're told to call an email
Yes.
to support or
Yeah.
oppose something. Is the legislature subject to open records? I mean, if a committee chair or a representative gets lots of emails and stuff like that, is that a written record that you can actually go back and track? How do you measure the calls and emails that come in? And is it official measurement, or is it just kind of your
It's
staff?
it's not official measurement. Staff's taking care of it. I will say emails, I think, and maybe the other legislators, we're gonna have a panel so we can talk about that, but I find that the email accounts are so saturated that I don't have time to look at them much during session, and it's a lot of effort to try to sort and to remove the junk from the real stuff, and so things get missed. And it's really, it varies from office to office and from legislator to legislator how effectively they can do that. The House representatives have like one administrative assistant to 6 to 8 legislators. And the Senate, it's better, we only have 2 senators per administrative assistant. So email, best case scenario, they get tabulated. Because a lot of these emails are just generated from websites, instead of individual. So your individual email's kind of gonna get lost in all that. But, Lori here sorts mine into folders so that I can get an idea of volume for each subject. And then she reports to me. I never really look at the emails. She reports to me when I'm getting lots of emails on a particular subject. So I think it's more effective to call. Yeah, because then you get the ear of a real person who could then, you could really affect them and make them motivated to actually talk to the legislator when they walk in the office that evening.
Be careful, I get angry and I want to curse back.
Well, also you have to be careful because that one administrative assistant might work for 6 to 8 different ones. And so you need to be cognizant of how many times you talk to the same person.
Yeah, you can trust that there's a message that's written down and given.
I don't know that you can trust it fully. It depends on the talent and the work habits of that individual person.
I always ask, are you keeping a tally?
It's a good question, yeah.
Sally?
Yes.
One thing that concerned me greatly, David Ralston's office, just as the abortion bill was getting hot and very hot, you call, and the message is full. I went up, I was in the Capitol that day, I went up to his office. The woman had just walked back in, she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I've been out to lunch." I said, "Well, your message is saying that the message thing is full. What is it with your technology that is so out of date that you can't take a few messages?" And that offended me, and I said to her, I said, "It's extremely important if people are saying, and the newspaper is printing, the fact that, they've gotten all these calls against, and you don't even know because you're not getting the calls."
Yeah,
And she really was very sorry, but I questioned the technology.
yeah, sure.
I don't know whether they just turned it off or.
Or nobody's emptying the messages?
Yeah.
Nobody's
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
out. They're out.
Another very effective way, if you do run into roadblocks like that, is postcards. It was very effective messaging if I showed up and there was a stack of postcards all on the same issue, handwritten. So those postcard parties, not only do people love them and it helps us, take care of each other and spend time together, it's actually a very effective way of messaging too. Let's see, I'm getting like the sign, but you know what? The panel that we're having is kind of the same sort of stuff, and it's not just me, it's other voices too, which will make it more interesting. So hold your questions, I think you'll be able to ask them with the panel.